Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar, which is second in our series on inclusive trade. Through this series, we continue to endeavor in our engagement with various academic debates, policy, as well as practice of international trade and development outcomes, really aiming to critically exploring the different dimensions of inclusion for international trade and trade policy. This is a conversation we are keen to contribute to as a collective, but also in the process, develop a strong network of participants who are interested as well as committed to taking this area forward. Just to note, another way we are continuing to build on this further is through our new professional short course, Making Trade Policy Inclusive, and that is being offered through a partnership with InterAnalysis and the UK Trade Policy Observatory at Sussex. And in fact, we will be kicking off this short course next week. So as part of this initiative and all of that sort of activity collective that I've just mentioned, today's seminar discusses sustainable development impact of trade and investment, a topic which is really critical at this moment. We know trade and investment can be effective as a means of implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. However, when we look at standalone trade and investment policies aimed at enhancing economic development, there may also be negative side effects. There may be spillovers on non-economic facets of sustainable development. So this seminar really discusses that and the accompanying role of trade facilitation, as well as the combined role of environmental, social, and complementary policies. Our speaker today is Dr. Badri Narayanan Gopalakrishnan. He is a lead advisor on trade and commerce at Niti Ayog, Government of India. I believe that's where he's joining us today. And Badri is an expert on international trade and actually has more than a decade of rich experience at the forefront of developing a computable general equilibrium models through a platform called GTAP, which is used to predict wider impacts of trade policies. Badri has also delivered guest lectures at IDS and is a founder of a very new and upcoming consultancy, Infisum, which focuses on development initiatives and works with various organizations around the world. Let me also invite and introduce an excellent panel of discussants. Today, we are joined by Dirk Willenbockel. Dirk is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. We also have Caroline Doman, who's a senior associate, International Institute for Sustainable Development, as well as Frank J. Duffer, who's the trade policy specialist at the Confederation of Tanzanian Industries. So we're really lucky, and it's a pleasure for us to be able to host all of you. Without further ado, I'll pass to Badri to kick us off with his presentation. I will then invite Dirk, Caroline, and Frank to provide comments before we wrap up and find a concluding message on the topic. Thank you very much. Over to you, Badri.
Thank you very much, Amrita, for the wonderful introduction and for inviting me to do this. And I also thank Dirk, Caroline, and Frank for spending time with this study and providing comments later. And also I'll take this opportunity to apologize for the last scheduled session where I couldn't come and it had to be rescheduled. But I'm very happy to be here now. And greetings to everyone. I'm not saying good morning or good afternoon because the audience is from all over the world. This particular paper, it's a working paper. It's available on the UN ESCAP ArtNet working paper series, and this was done a while ago, and but I think it's still relevant now. And I should also thank my co-authors, Jan Duval and Alexei Kraventsov, both of whom are at UNESCAP, and Deepika Vadva, who was my team member. So in this paper, what we did was, it was actually a paper that was commissioned by the UN, UNESCAP's Trade and Investment Division. So there was an increasing, worry in the mainstream trade policy circles that we cannot only talk about free trade and liberalizing trade and investment, but we should also talk about the sustainability aspects, because they're getting to the forefront. And rather than let the people who are specialized in sustainable development talk about how trade affects it and so on, we as trade economists, trade policy enthusiasts, trade policy catalysts, we ourselves should get into this discussion and do the analysis and see how, the first question is how trade and investment can promote or hamper sustainable development, and if it promotes, how can we make it even better, and if it hampers, how do we reduce the negative effects of trade and investment on sustainable development. So it's kind of a fundamental question that lingers around many policymakers. So we decided to look at this. That is how they were interested in doing this. In fact, this was a part of the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report in 2017, if I remember correctly, or 2018. So this was very much part of a policy document, but it's still a research paper. So I'm going to discuss, walk you through some of the highlights of the study, and I'm intentionally I'm keeping this discussion relatively less technical. So I'm not getting into the details of the model assumptions and so on, but I'm just giving you a very high level overview. So I'm going to divide this into these 4 sections, like introduction, methodology, results, and policy implications. So one, as I just mentioned, how can trade and investment liberalization affect sustainability? That's a fundamental question that we ask. And sustainability is a big bag of multiple things. Like once I was presenting, I think this paper or some other paper in a university, where I had affiliation with the University of Washington, Seattle, in a brown bag seminar. And one of the very senior faculty member asked me, what do you define as sustainable development? Like what are the different things? I mean, he was not exactly asking for definition, but he was asking what are the different things that you bring under sustainable development. Then I was giving him some examples, and he said, "Okay, so anything that looks nice is sustainable. any nice thing is part of sustainable development." So, of course, the fact is that now we have as I'm going to show in the next slide, we have a clear-cut definition of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and we have targets and so on. But from a modeling point of view, because this is a trade economic modeling exercise, is what I did. And here I had a lot of constraints. I couldn't look at each of the goals separately and specifically. So I thought, why don't we just consider things that are easy to look into this kind of a model. So some things that can be quantified in an easier way. So we looked at these 3 aspects: CO2 emissions. You may ask, what about non-CO2 emissions? What about air pollutants? But yes, they can be done, but we just focus on this. And in subsequent papers later, I also looked at them. But for this paper, we looked at CO2 emissions. Secondly, food security. Again, it's a very big umbrella of things, and we particularly look at undernourishment in particular. Again, you can ask how about other aspects of food security, but no, we are just focusing on one of them. And the last aspect is inequality. Again, inequality is a big canvas of things. You can think about household level inequality, you can think about inequality among workers and so on, or even employment inequality in terms of employment opportunities and so on. But I'm looking at the wage income inequality. So there are different skills like unskilled labor, skilled labor. So looking at their wage and income inequality. So these are 3 aspects we're looking at. So of course you have these are the different SDGs, and you can think of them as as a, like they correspond to different dimensions. So if you look at this, it's difficult to exactly relate one-on-one with the list of things I had. For example, reduce inequalities will be directly relevant for my the wage income inequality that I mentioned, but it may also, to some extent, touch upon this decent work, because decent work also includes decent wages, and that is one. And then you have climate action. So climate action, definitely it can be climate mitigation, it can be climate adaptation. So the mitigation part is what we are looking at, CO2 emissions. And of course, you also have, when you think about sustainable consumption, production, sustainable cities and communities, here also you have some element of emissions, some element of inequality, some element of food security, and so on. So the first two, no poverty, no food security, I mean no hunger, food security, sustainable agriculture, that is what we are touching upon here. So of course, we are not looking at all the things here. So we are looking at like 6 or 7 different goals, which you can easily quantify using the model. So now, what are the different kind of policies can we think of? When you talk to any trade economist, when you're talking about trade policy, the first thing that comes to your mind is tariff elimination. So what about removing all the import tariffs, all the custom duties? So that is one thing. The second thing is investment liberalization. So that reduce all the barriers to investment, what we call as phantom taxes, like some kind of tax equivalent of barriers can be removed. The third aspect is implementation of trade facilitation, and following upon the trade facilitation agreement, the WTO trade facilitation agreement, that can actually reduce a lot of non-tariff barriers, time as a barrier to trade, and those kind of things. Fourth aspect is aid for trade. So how about income transfers are made from richer countries to poorer countries? So that aspect. And the reason that is interesting and important is because some countries, when the poorer countries lose due to trade or investment liberalization, then it's important to compensate them, because when the richer countries become richer and poorer countries become poorer, so there is a case for aid for trade. So okay, you open up your trade, but we'll provide you some aid so that your losses are compensated. Of course, the traditional aid for trade is different. So here I'm talking about the aid as a compensation for losses due to trade and investment. Another thing is emission constraints. So we took, for example, the Paris Agreement. Based on the Paris Agreement, what would be the extent to which we'll restrict the emissions, reduce the emissions. Then the last thing is income transfers to the poorer people. So from the government to the poorer people, so which is kind of a redistribution thing within the country. So these are different policy shocks we consider. Okay, so of course I don't, the boxes that you see are basically arrow marks. So I'm just discussing the high level mechanisms, how trade and investment. When you see trade, you can read trade and investment. So how trade and investment liberalization can lead to these different outcomes. So the first hypothesis is that when you liberalize trade, particularly your food sectors are going to see some reduction in prices and increase in supply, because you have cheaper imports of food commodities and also cheaper imports of other commodities that are needed as an input to the food production, food sector, agricultural sector. So in effect, there is going to be a reduction in prices of food and increase in the supply of food. That means there is going to be greater food security. So you're going to have cheaper food and more abundant food. So that is one kind of thought process. The second thought process for emissions is that when trade happens, you are going to increase economic activity, and the increase in economic activity can be emission intensive, or it can be renewables and non-emission intensive. For example, there can be for example, some countries may have like a huge tariff on windmill equipment. So now you reduce the tariffs and windmill equipment become cheaper, and there is a lot of windmills being set up, and that reduces their emissions. Or you can think of, in a given country, let's say a developed country, you reduce tariffs on dirty goods that are, that are emission intensive, chemicals, metals, and so on. So then you're going to import them, which means that in your country, you're going to see a reduction in emissions because you're going to reduce your sector, reduce your chemical sector, reduce your metal sector, but instead you're going to import it from another country, and obviously emissions are going to rise in that another country, but in your country, emissions are going to fall. So these are some examples where emissions can fall, but there are many, many examples where emissions can increase when trade liberalization happens, because when trade liberalization happens, typically overall economy expands. You have a greater consumption, greater production, and so on, and that increases overall economic activity. And if your carbon intensity doesn't go down, your emission intensity doesn't go down, then greater economic activity with the same emissions intensity means greater emissions, right? So both are possible. In my observation, as we may see in this paper, emissions typically rise when trade liberation happens, typically, but there are some exceptions. So that is one. So it can rise or fall. The next aspect is the inequality aspect. So when you have liberalization, production can increase in different sectors. Production can decrease in some sectors. Production can decrease in sectors which are highly protected right now, and the moment you remove tariffs, you get a huge import competition, and your production can fall. And production can increase when your inputs are going to be cheaper. Your let's say, for example, automobile industry, you're reducing reducing tariffs on auto components, engines, parts, and so on. So then what you're doing is you're making the parts cheaper. So that means that the auto production is going to get benefited, and you're going to produce more automobiles. So production can increase or decrease. So now if production increases in skilled labor intensive sectors, and it decreases or remains the same in unskilled labor intensive sectors, then the wages of skilled labor can increase because there is greater demand for skilled labor. So you are expanding a skill intensive sector, which means that there is going to be greater demand for skilled labor, which means that the inequality can increase. The income inequality between skilled and unskilled labor can increase because skilled labor is already getting more wages, and now it's going to get even higher wages. So the inequality is going to widen. But you can also think of the other way around, wherein the trade leads to increase in production of unskilled intensive sectors, labor intensive sectors. So in which case the inequality can get reduced because the unskilled wages may increase, catching up with the skilled wages. So that these are some high level explanations or hypotheses that I have, and later on when I show the results, I won't explain them in depth, because these hypotheses would already give you an idea that if something increases, this is the reason; if something decreases, this is the reason. So we used this model called GTAP model, Global Trade Analysis Project, which Amrita briefly mentioned. So it's a multi-country, multi-sector computable general equilibrium model. In very simple terms, it's kind of like a global supply chain economic model, where you have international trade happening between countries at sector level, and you have intersectoral linkages within a country, and so on. So I'm not getting into the details, but yes, we use a version called GDYNE, that is a dynamic model of zeta, which includes time periods. And so we do two exercises. One is the zeta based modeling, but before that we also do an econometric exercise using the FAO data. So using the Food and Agriculture Organization dataset, we looked at all these different variables for these years, 25 years, 1990 to 2015, for 217 countries, pretty much the entire world. looking at calorie supply, dietary energy supply, adequacy, protein supply, food production, and prevalence of undernourishment in percentage. So all these food security variables we had, and we did a regression. So this is the empirical methodology, the econometric methodology. So what we did was we did a panel regression with this simultaneous equations. So you had we did a lot of different variations, and finally we came up with this. So we said that dietary adequacy depends on the food, proteins, and calories. Calories in turn is dependent on diet, food, and protein, and undernourishment depends on all of these. And I'm not getting into the details of how we specified it because it took a long time. We looked at the literature and we did a lot of estimation. Finally, we came to this. But basically, this is the thing that finally matters. So we find undernourishment as a function of all these things, and each of these things are expressed as a function of food production, agricultural production, and imports, agricultural production, imports, and exports. So we have we link each of them to the individual crops, individual types of crops. For example, protein is mapped to oil seeds, meat, and so on, and calories in general is mapped to all the food sectors and so on. So we had to do all this mapping, and then we came to the model. So and we also do a little bit of non-tariff barriers. We use a method called NOVI 2012. They use in very simple terms. What they do is they take the extent to which trade happens within the country in a given product, and compare that with the trade happening between two countries. So when you benchmark this, if a country trades a lot within itself, but trades very little with a third country, or second country, another country, then the NTV is very high, then the non-tariff measure is high, and vice versa. So we make this kind of methodology to estimate the non-tariff barriers, and we use the GTAP's dynamic model. And as I just mentioned previously, we use the whole equations, the three equations that I mentioned, and we define the food production and protein supply as a function of the GTAP variables, which capture production and consumption of the specific products, specific agricultural and food sectors. So basically what we capture is like going back to the second or third slide where I mentioned what are the different channels. So food production, food imports, food prices, these are all going to affect undernourishment. That's the idea. Okay, so now jumping to the different scenarios. So we take this to 2030. So that's why the study is hopefully relevant even now. Of course, we did this study before COVID, so we haven't taken into account the COVID pandemic effects and so on. But still, it's a longer term study, so a lot of things are directionally still correct. So we look at actually 6 different scenarios. So the first scenario is complete tariff elimination within the Asia Pacific region, and the second scenario is trade facilitation implementation, which is basically a reduction of non-tariff barriers that I discussed before. And third scenario is an investment liberalization, which is basically reducing the taxes on capital goods. So we have taxes on capital goods and phantom taxes, and we reduce them. Very basically reducing the barriers to invest. And the fourth scenario is all the trade and investment liberalization scenarios 1, 2, 3, and on top of it add the Paris Accord commitments. So all the emission constraints are in place. Scenario 5 is all the trade and investment liberalization scenarios, plus the income transfers, to what extent income gets transferred from the richer countries to poorer countries, and skilled workers to unskilled workers, and so on. So that is a fifth scenario. Sixth scenario is like what we all want actually, right? So we have all the trade and investment liberalization. We have the emission constraint from Paris Agreement. We also have the income transfers. So it's like the nicest thing that we can ever witness, because we have all trade and investment opened up, and we have climate mitigation taken care of. We have the income taken care of. It's like a super good scenario, save the world kind of scenario. So now I'm coming into the results of the model. So initially, I'm just glimpsing at the empirical results, the econometric results. So if these are the coefficients that you estimated, all these coefficients were significant at at all levels of significance. Basically, like, as you can see, the p-value was less than 0.0001, and the R square was greater than 0.95. So it was pretty well specified. So we saw that all the signs were as expected. So we wanted calories to have positive effect on diet. Yes, we did find that. We wanted protein to have positive effect on diet. Yes, we found that. Diet of positively affecting calories. Yes. Food production calories. Yes, but not so big, which is interesting. But protein has a positive impact on calories. And now coming to undernourishment, all the variables have negative effect. So calories, if you have greater calories, then undernourishment will fall. Greater dietary energy adequacy, undernourishment will fall. Greater protein intake, again undernourishment will fall. So it's all nothing controversial here. We get pretty much expected results. Okay, now I'm jumping into the results. I just want to mention that I don't show the baseline. So we did a lot of work on baseline. So we had to make sure that we have a sense of what happens from today until 2030 by default, status quo, business as usual scenario. And then each of the scenarios, the numbers you see here are deviations from the baseline. And these are annual average deviations. So for example, with trade and investment liberalization, with the tariff liberalization, China would expect 0.03% higher GDP every year compared to baseline. Japan would get similar effect, 0.03% higher. So all these numbers are in percentage changes and percentage deviations from the baseline annually. So you can see pretty much all numbers are positive here. Obviously, you see the magnitude varying by scenario. If you take China, for example, you see that it gains the most in the second scenario, which is I think trade facilitation, and or the third scenario which is investment. It is not that high, but when you combine all the three, you have when you combine all the three and add emission constraint, typically if you simply combine all the three, you would have got something like 1.3%. But because of some emission constraints, instead of 1.3%, you get something like 1%. And if you add, if you also do inequality adjustment, income transfers, it goes down a little more. But then the nice thing is, if you combine everything, if you're in the best of all worlds, where you have everything taken care of, then you get the same effect as the scenario 4, the Paris Agreement effect. So there's a lot of stories hidden behind here in each of these lines. And if you take India, for example, very limited, relatively limited gains from tariff liberalization, but yes, nonetheless, it's 0.06% of like a $3 trillion economy, which is pretty large. And then you have NTB trade facilitation has a pretty profound positive effect. Investment liberation has a good sizable positive effect. And with emission constraint, the combined effect gets reduced a little bit, and with inequality thing, it reduces, it gets reduced even more. But when you combine all of them, you go somewhere in between. So you're better off than the inequality, just inequality scenario, and you're worse off than the just emission constraint scenario. So this is where we are. So likewise, I can keep talking about each country, but if you look at Asia Pacific overall, which is what we big focus was in the study, you see pretty much similar in terms of the directions, like a small effect due to tariff liberalization, huge effect used to due to NTB or trade facilitation, sizable effect because of investment, relatively small effect compared to the all the three scenarios combined together when you account for emissions, and if you account for inequality, transfers, then it goes down even more. In the combined scenario, it is still low, similar to inequality scenario. So this is basically one thing I can say with some level or degree of confidence from here is that you're not looking at an order of magnitude losses because of the complementary policies. I call this emissions, this social redistribution. So these policies, I call them as complementary policies along with trade, and we see that like contrary to popular opinion, contrary to what many people would like to believe, the effect, the reduction of positive impact of trade and investment liberalization is not huge. It is negligible with the complementary policies. That's very encouraging. So we can actually, purely from an economic point of view, GDP point of view, we are not talking about like a huge sacrifice by doing the complementary thing. But the bigger thing is, to what extent can you benefit from it? To what extent can you really benefit from in terms of, for example, undernourishment? To what extent can you benefit? So yes, the nice thing is undernourishment is full of negatives. So any change in the world from today, any kind of positive change like trade liberalization, tariff liberalization, investment, NTB, anything is going to lead to reduction in undernourishment pretty much across the world. There are some small positives here and there, but broadly speaking, it is all negative. And the extent to which it's negative depends on the scenario. So if you look at the Paris Agreement scenario, the extent of undernourishment reduction is not as big as it would be with all the three together, because some of the sectors which have to fall to reduce emissions would be some of the agricultural sectors, some of the meat sectors, and so on, that might have affected it here. But if you just focus on income transfers, yeah, we are in the best world. If you can reduce undernourishment quite a bit, if you just transfer income from rich to poor, and that you can see both in China and in India. That's the most positive, the biggest reduction in undernourishment happens in the scenario 5, which is the income transfer scenario. And the overall scenario is not too bad. My benchmark is this non-tariff barrier or trade facilitation scenario. So when I compare with that, these are slightly better. So of course, if you add everything, they are still small. But if you just take this as a benchmark, they're not bad. So inequality, if you look at inequality, where I look at this Gini coefficient of skilled and unskilled labor income, let me first jump into the global inter-country inequality, the richest versus the poorest country. So there, tariff liberalization absolutely has almost no effect, whereas all other scenarios are going to have a negative effect on inequalities. Inequality is going to fall, except for scenario 4, which is Paris Agreement. So when you take into account the emissions, since the developing countries are not that well equipped when it comes to emissions reduction, and whereas the developed countries are more well equipped. So there is some increase in inequality that is happening there. But then if you take into account all the other, like income transfers and so on, then you get a pretty huge reduction in inequality globally. Within country, you see that the effects are not that huge, but they are mostly negative. In mostly in like first or second decimal point. But in countries like India, it's almost no change or slightly increasing. So I don't have to repeat why this variation happens. But broadly, anything can happen to inequality because trade is going to favor some sectors and it's not going to favor some other sectors, depending on where you belong to, where the poor people belong to. Based on that, the inequality can get affected. So if poorer people belong to the benefiting sectors, inequality is going to fall. So it so happens that in countries like India, it doesn't happen. I mean, there is no huge mobilization away from rich countries to rich workers to poor workers in terms of sectors. In terms of emissions, it's pretty much as expected. The emission scenario, the Paris Agreement scenario, you see the biggest reduction in emissions. In all other scenarios, you don't see much change in emissions, which in itself is a good news. Because I was telling earlier that with trade, you're looking at either increase in emissions or decrease in emissions. Anything can happen, but what we see here is either very small increase or no increase, or some large decreases. Like Vietnam, we can see pretty big decreases in emissions, and in many other countries you see some reductions, but a lot of countries have pretty much no implication for emissions, because of the trade policies and investment policies. So that in itself is an encouraging thing, because typically we think that the more prosperous we are, the more open we are to trade and investment, the more emissions we may generate. But fortunately, that's not what we see here. I don't know how much more time I have, but here I'm just kind of summarizing all these results. So I also talk about certain.
Badri, you've got,
Yeah.
If you could provide us some concluding messages. You've got 4 more minutes.
We have how much more time?
You've got 4 more minutes, and
4
then
minutes.
we'll
Okay.
have the
Okay.
discussions. Is that okay?
Oh,
Yeah.
oh, great. Yeah, I'm almost done then. So I can just, these are all repetitions. Like basically whatever I explained in the figures, I just put them in slides again. So yes, the undernourishment, the story is, as I told earlier, trade increases availability of food. So that's why you see undernourishment falling in most cases. Income transfers, increases it even more. In terms of inequality, you see some reductions, but there are some exceptions. These are exceptions. That's because the skilled labor gains more than the unskilled labor, and that's why we see some inequality increasing, and income transfers can help reduce it even more. So just one last thing I wanted to show is what is the alternative. So I've been talking only about this hunky-dory story of trade and investment, liberalization, and so on. So what if we just do this tariff hikes globally? And this was a time when the US China was going on, US EU, like a lot of tariff hikes were going on, Brexit was going on. So we thought, why don't we look at tariff hikes? And we just got a pretty easy answer, like a bunch of negative numbers on GDP. That will switch off everyone. Okay, the moment you say you're going to lose GDP, we are convinced that tariff hikes are bad. But you also see this increase in undernourishment in many countries, particularly see like sub-Saharan Africa, such a huge increase. And then you look at emissions. Emissions, there are mixed stories. Like sometimes because of tariff hikes, you have a contracted economy, and that's going to reduce emissions. In some cases you see, but in some cases it also, even that increases emissions, because in some countries, the tariff hikes leads to they lead to increased production, because you have less competition from imports, you have more production, that leads to greater emissions. Inequality was not much affected because of tariff hikes, because things were happening in all directions. You have skill labor gaining, skill labor losing because of fewer opportunities. In some cases, unskilled labor losing, and so on. So I think this is my very last slide. So I think when like in terms of policy implications, the first thing I want to say is that you should not take this study seriously. The reason being that you have to do a lot of due diligence. Like when policymakers do this, is just a sample that you can do something like this, but the policymakers have to do a lot of due diligence, looking at sector level, like and maybe there is some need to think about the promoting labor intensive sectors when it comes to negotiations. How do we get market access to labor intensive sectors, and so on. So maybe so that is one thing. And secondly, yes, there is going to be some, we have to understand the reality that there is going to be, at least in this study we saw emissions. Sometimes emissions can increase because of trade. In some cases, even inequality can increase to some extent. Undernourishment is probably only robust result here, that always undernourishment falls when trade expands. But one has to think about these other aspects, during trade. So the caveat that I want to mention is that all the results that we see here, one should not again think of them as universal, like it's always going to, undernourishment is always going to fall because of trade, and so on. So these are going to be very specific to countries and sectors that we chose here. When you negotiate a trade agreement, I think these things can be, this kind of analysis framework can be useful. So we are presenting more a framework than policy lessons, but there are some qualitative policy lessons that can be learned here, more than quantitative, like saying that this is the extent of effect and so on. So with that, I conclude my part of the discussion, and I look forward to the discussions. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Badri. Thank you for really that really interesting and engaging presentation. No doubt that this was quite a lot of effort. You've put together all this rich data, and of course, the economic modeling behind it is pretty has been quite a lot of effort, definitely. What is interesting is that you do provide us at the end caveats that, we need to dig further. So this is not the end, this is the starting point. Before I go to the discussants, I think I'd just like to add a couple of questions of my own, and then I'll pass first to Dirk, and then to Caroline, and then to Frank, and maybe you can take all the questions together at the end. So my questions are really reflections. I think you really show that we need, some solid evidence to understand better how international trade or spillovers from trade are affecting inequality outcomes. What could be interesting, and I'm, also this is sort of thinking out loud in terms of extensions of this work, is that, what about the intersections across these different dimensions? So for example, food production, emissions, and all the other aspects that you mentioned. There are obvious intersections across these different dimensions. Is there any way that this can be better accounted for, or is there then the need to combine such economic modeling with better qualitative evidence that sort of gets us closer to some of understanding some of those intersections and therefore the trade-offs? My second question, and this is more a question, is I'd be really interested to understand the nutrition dimension. I know you explained what you did in terms of calories and undernourishment, etc. But there's a huge debate in the food security literature about nutrition and diets. And of course, there's an important gender dimension to it. Now, I know you cannot do everything in one model, but it would be interesting to think maybe together in terms of the gender aspects here. And finally, I think you said, you mentioned one aspect of aid being a compensation of potential losses. My question is really, are such complementary policies sufficient, or do we need more sort of thinking about sort of longer term structural changes, which would be, including more inclusive aspects centrally, or mainstreaming inclusion more centrally into trade, rather than, it being an afterthought of, okay, let's compensate the losses. So I'll stop there. I'll now invite Dirk, then Caroline, and then Frank. Thank you very much. Dirk, over to you.
Yes, just trying to share the screen.
We can see your screen now.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's an honor and a pleasure to be invited as a panelist. Badri, of course, is a highly regarded member of the international modeling community, and I reread this paper with great interest. So this is obviously a very impressive study just in terms of the breadth of coverage of highly topical issues. What I particularly like about the paper that it recognizes the potential trade-offs and synergies among policies to address the various SDGs, which calls for integrated approaches towards ex-ante policy evaluations, simulation of different measures to achieve the SDGs. And the paper makes an important step towards the further development of such integrated evaluation approaches, and it does all of that in a fairly short paper, now in about 40 pages, now in about 40 minutes of presentation. As I'm a CGE modeler myself, I would of course would have liked a lot of more about the technical details of how the different simulation scenarios were set up, in particular how the investment liberalization measures were modeled, and how exactly the Paris Accord was set up, because I suppose you didn't go one by one through the NDCs of the different countries and look at what they are proposing in terms of mitigation. Then a couple of specific questions. If I understand your what we call scenario 4, your Paris Accord simulation plus the tariff and investment liberalization measures, then you're getting actually positive effects on economic growth, at least for a subset of countries. So for instance, on your GDP changed slide, I see a quite significant positive net effect of the Paris Accord for sub-Saharan Africa in particular. So specific question I had there is what are precisely the economic mechanisms that drive such positive growth effects associated with implementing the Paris Accord. Then another question closer to the actual topic of this seminar. I'm wondering to which extent you actually incorporate the real resource costs associated with the implementation of the trade facilitation measures. Somewhere in your paper, you mentioned this figure that about 300 billion US dollars had been expended on trade facilitation measures. Clear precisely over which period, but this figure alone suggests that given your broad definition of trade facilitation, which includes investments in physical trade infrastructure, which is very expensive, whether your model actually incorporates that someone has to pay for this. And then my third question is, why do you systematically exclude capital income from all your discussion of inequality effects? So you define inequality in terms of the wage gap between skilled and unskilled labor, but your model allows to look at the capital income side of the distribution questions, and in the light of recent discussions about Piketty and so forth, who emphasizes the big role of capital income and capital wealth for distributional impacts. I'm wondering why you made this decision to focus exclusively on wage differentials. And coming to an end, forget the first point here, that refers to the presentation of results in the paper. In your presentation now, you actually had a more disaggregated presentation of results. But what I, being a CGE modeler myself, is really I'm missing the technical background paper to this background paper for the UN ESCAP report, to learn more about the technical details of what you've done in these simulations. So if you intend to do further work in this direction in the future, please put a supplementary information files somewhere where modelers like me can bite their teeth into. But thanks for this very interesting presentation, and I'm stopping there.
Thanks, Dirk. Can I now invite Caroline?
Thanks. And thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really appreciating this discussion so far, and value having this opportunity to exchange. So in my comments, I'm going to take a slightly different tack, and I'll sort of ask the question in a similar way. I think ask sort of the same starting question as Badri, but I'll focus on a different way of undertaking, a different approach to undertaking integrated evaluation of the economic, social, and environmental impacts of different trade policy options. And of course, the objective of the evaluation being to inform decision-making with a view to achieving inclusive SDG consistent trade policy. So it's an introductory point to illustrate a bit where I come from, is the need to emphasize, I think, the need to consider the economic with the social and the environmental impacts of trade. Statements to the effect that environmental and social goals can be advanced in parallel with trade-driven economic developments are quite common, not just in this paper. And I actually find it a little bit problematic. And the reason is that by treating these dimensions as being on parallel tracks, we really keep them separate. Parallel lines, by definition, never meet. So my contention is that we must move towards methods for evaluating impacts of choosing trade policy options that integrate the three together from the very outset. And I must say that Badri's opening point about, UNSCAP, instead of asking sustainable development specialists to look at the impacts of trade, they turn to trade economists to look at sustainable development. And I think in my ideal world, there wouldn't be this separation, and this exercise would be done together. So coming more specifically to the paper, I was really impressed by it, but I must admit that as I'm not a CGE modeler, I tend to be quite easily impressed by economic modeling, as my background is more from the social sciences. But beyond that, like Dirk, I appreciate that the paper combines different elements in the model and includes a range of different factors. Critics might argue that other models and GTAP-based ones are better suited, but that's a different debate, which I won't go into now. And the paper itself says that it doesn't cover all dimensions of the links between trade and trade policy and sustainability. And we know that mathematical models, although they're immensely useful, are simplifications of reality. And Badri, you yourself said that. And actually, I found myself, in reading the paper, I found myself really itching to be able to repeat the exercise with you, Badri, and perhaps with you, Dirk, as well. In a sense, overlaying and embedding the insights from the type of approach that I use with the quantitative approaches that Badri and your co-authors use. The approach, so what I wanted to do in just a couple of minutes now would be to sort of give a little illustration of how I would apply my approach. My approach is often based on the human rights framework. And so I just wanted to illustrate the very first stage of how a human rights approach works. And Badri, I could almost ask you to put up your first slide, because this goes to the very first stage, which is how do we define the scope of the evaluation? And actually, before I go on to talking about how I would apply the human rights approach to define the scope of the evaluation, I must stress that I'm not talking about measuring the impacts of trade on human rights. What I'm talking about is using a human rights-based approach to improve our understanding of the impacts of trade. And I really do believe that human rights can help us get to questions and impacts that some of the more usual modeling often miss. And I'm not going to go into details here, but I'm happy to respond to questions or share more afterwards. But just maybe one of the two, maybe the two principles to bear in mind for the purpose of this discussion is non-discrimination between different sectors of the population and the accountability issue. So back to the question of how would I use a human rights approach to define the scope of the evaluation? The way this works is to start by identifying who are the most vulnerable group or groups in the country or region at stake. So of course, this would vary between countries, but probably even at the level of the Asian region, we can identify probably a manageable number, and it might be migrant workers, it might be women, it might be low-skilled youth. In some countries, it might be a particular ethnic group or people in a particularly geographical remote region. Then the human rights approach, the second point. So I should just say, so in contrast, and picking up on a point of Badri, that the choice of this is really focusing on the people who are the most vulnerable, not starting from where can I find the data, but saying, well, actually, who are the people? Who are the people's lives who are likely to be affected for better or for worse by liberalization? Then the second step in the scoping exercise would be to make contact with the people from the groups identified, or people who work with those groups, and seek out their view of what they would say indicates economic, social, and environmental vulnerability or progress. And this would then help in this next stage, which was it would help identify which particular trade measures are of concern and worth modeling the impacts of. And so it could be, and Badri explained why they made the choices they did, but it could be actually services trade liberalization that's of more concern than tariff reductions, or the government procurement liberalization might be affected more. So this very first stage of seeking out the views of vulnerable groups helps identify also which factors should be attempted to be measured to evaluate the sustainable development impacts. And it could be, for instance, the environmental factor of most salient concern might be coastal erosion or deforestation. So then we would start looking, how can we account for those factors as opposed to CO2 emissions? So yeah, and then again, a human rights approach would then want to break down the data within countries. For instance, undernourishment, human rights would alert us to the fact that we can't use overall country data. We have to look again at those vulnerable groups we identified in the very first stage. So I think the benefits of the type of approach that I propose lies in its very process, in a sense. Being a bottom-up approach, arising from the lived experiences of the people who are most vulnerable, as opposed to what the economic modelers think are important, it really brings to light what concerns emerge from lived realities. And most importantly, it entails a conversation between stakeholders, between the people who design the models and the decision makers who are going to implement the policies based on the evaluation. And I think this can really help fill some gaps. And just picking up on Rita's point about combining qualitative and qualitative approaches, we know that no model is perfect. No model, no approach probably will get to everything. And maybe the challenge that we set for ourselves is, how do we get as close as possible to getting a sense of what the different environmental, social, and economic impacts of particular trade measures would be?
Thank you, Caroline, for that really interesting addition. Can I now invite Frank? Frank, are you with us?
Yes. Thank you, Amrita. And I would also like to commend Badri and his team for the wonderful work. It's really creative, a creative way and an approach to try to match sustainability and all these trade facilitation measures and policies. So on my end, I would not want to repeat what Caroline has said, what you, Amrita, has said, and Dirk, but I would like to emphasize that this is a very wonderful approach now to try to integrate and to see how it can best inform ongoing initiatives. For example, for countries like ours in Africa, which are LDCs and Sub-Sahara, where right now we are talking of issues of Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We want to have a common market. We want to have all these kinds of reforms. But then again, if you look at how we are going about the whole exercise, most of the decisions and the reforms that are made are either very political, and they are sometimes not considering the social demographical impact of whatever reforms that we are currently taking. And I would even say sometimes you would see we are trying to make reforms maybe to open up our borders, to have these systems for collecting maybe taxes or for clearing goods. But most of the time you see it's an effort maybe to create revenue more than to try to see maybe women are having better cross-border trade, or to see marginalized groups being more promoted in such kind of sustainable kind of initiatives. So I think it's a wonderful approach, but then again, echoing a bit of what was said by Caroline, it's hard to have some of these things quantified in economic models. I myself am not that much deep into modeling and econometrics, and I would really commend the attempts made by Badri and his team. So going forward, I think now we have that challenge to see how, especially for the LDCs, where we have a huge informal sector, where sometimes it's even hard to have even a clear understanding of how these sustainability issues can be incorporated into policies and reforms. But also we have some sort of protectionism still existing. I would say even being in part of EAC, where we are being commended as one of the most progressively, I would say, integrated region. We still have a lot of protectionist kind of taxes, which are sometimes leading to uncompetitive and promoting even more unfair, I would say, leading to these market failures, oligopolies and such kind of markets. So it's really something to think about and to ponder going forward, how we can factor in such kind of realities which are there, protectionism, the informality of our economies, and some of these issues which are sometimes cultural. I would say that our governments are still more focused on collecting revenue. When they are making reforms, it's for them to make it easy to collect more and see what is coming in, but not to really look at the marginalized groups or the sustainable side of it. And one critical side also, the capacity of our countries. We know at one point I saw a statement in the report which says, I think something like this is an unfinancial way of making people comply to sustainable. There's that kind of statement. I think Badri can relate. So I would still say it still has some sort of an implication in terms of cost to meet these kind of reforms. We can learn from the experience that we have right now in our countries. Even ratifying the trade facilitation agreement, we had to get support from maybe EU or other advanced economies to buy laptops for opening up these inquiry points and all that. So you can see there is a lot of a financial component related to it, and a business conscious that is required even by companies and individuals to really demand these kind of reforms or services which will make the sustainable side of businesses. So I would just submit that little from me, and maybe as we go on, we can get some more reflection. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your perspectives from Tanzania. Over to you, Badri. You've got a hard task of responding to a really interesting set of questions, but you've got 10 minutes. So I'd say, prioritize a little bit, but we'd love to hear what you've got to say.
Thank you so much, Amrita and Caroline, Dirk, and Frank. These are wonderful questions and points of discussion. On your first point, Amrita, on understanding the intersections more, so I couldn't have agreed more with you. It's definitely we tried to make a beginning here by just combining all these different things, but a lot more has to be done there. I agree with you. On your questions, particularly on this nutrition and gender, yes, you are absolutely right. These are very important, and I myself haven't done a lot of work on nutrition apart from this little work on undernourishment. But on gender, we have done some work by looking at labor, breaking down labor into male and female, and understanding where females work more, where males work more, and depending on the trade, how trade affects different sectors, it's going to be biased towards women or biased towards men, that kind of thing. But like what Caroline mentioned, there is also a lot of social aspects here. Like sometimes there are cultural and social aspects. Sometimes because of trade, in remote rural areas in some developing countries, because of trade opening and exposure to the rest of the world, there can be some gender equity that can happen, by cultural changes and so on. So I think there is a lot of investigation needed along those lines. I agree with you, and you also raised another very interesting point about complementarity. There's this complementary policies. Should we really go for this complementary policies, or come up with some structurally considered trade policies? And again, that's a great point. And in fact, here we restricted ourselves to only the when we said complementary policies, we didn't mean absolutely complementary and absolutely like inequality reducing or emissions reducing or something, but on top of the trade agreement. So complementary to the trade liberalization. But yes, we have to have a separate debate on how structurally we have to evolve the other economic policies to ensure that there is great benefit. And again here during using this complementary policies, we are just trying to scratch the surface of what you said. Like yeah, we want this trade thing, but at the same time we want inequality to be reduced and so on. But a lot more has to be done to think deeply structurally. And coming to a nice set of detailed comments from Dirk. First of all, thanks a lot, Dirk, for spending so much quality time to look at our paper. And these are really amazing points. Thanks for your comments in general. Coming to your questions, on the first question, economic mechanisms that drive the positive economic growth effects with implementing Paris Accord. Actually, if you see carefully, I mean the results I show are a little deceptive because what I show is this 1 + 2 + 3 plus Paris Agreement. So if you compare if you just simply add 1 + 2 + 3, if you simply add the trade and investment liberalization, you in many cases you actually see a bigger positive effect compared to the what you get after implementing Paris Accord, which means that Paris Accord inherently has a small negative effect. But yes, in some cases, what you said also happens in some very rare exceptions. There, the explanations are twofold. One is that the trade is actually helping emissions reduction naturally. So when you impose these constraints, it's basically going in the same direction of economic growth benefit. So that is happening, but that's not that as far as I can see, it doesn't happen in a lot of countries and particularly not in big countries. So that is one kind of clarification I wanted to mention. On the second question about who pays for the all these measures, right? Trade facilitation, physical, and so on. And this again, Frank also mentioned this a great point. Yes, so as you know, in CG models, these are implicitly captured. I was thinking of capturing it explicitly. So when I say implicitly, the way to your question, it's paid by the entire country, the households and the government together. Of course, we don't increase taxes, but it's increased in terms of things are when you increase let's say investment demand, then the purchases are made by mainly by the government sector, but also to some extent by the industries. So it's a combined investment made by private households, firms, and the government. But yes, one can, and again coming back to what Frank mentioned, some of the African countries got support from EU, right? That's a great example how some of these costs need not be borne by the domestic economy, but by other countries. This also can be aid. So we don't get into that part of the discussion, but we just agnostically say that it's paid by anyone. So that is a shortcoming, I would say. I would agree with you that it's a shortcoming. We should dig deeper into that and come up with a better model to capture that. So that is one thing. And this beautiful point that you raised about capital income, frankly speaking, it just occurred to me after you raised the question. It occurred to me that I myself was asking myself that why did I even ignore this? But I had a reason why the reason why I only looked at labor. I didn't even think about capital. The reason why I only looked at labor was typically the way inequality is done is by looking at the rich household, poor household, and so on. So since I did not have that in the model, So I was thinking, okay, I can just map labor to household. So I can just say that unskilled labor is poor household and skilled labor is rich household. Of course, we have 5 different types of labor. So different, each labor corresponds to a different wage level, and correspondingly, I can say it's a different type of household. So I totally did not take into account the fact that capital income is also a kind of income, and land. For that matter, I should also have included land and natural resources as well, because those are also income generating factors. So to this point, I can only say that I just have this weak justification that I did not. I just mapped labor to households and thought of it that way, but that's not a good justification. So I think when I revisit this work in the future, this is really nice that I can include capital as well. And in fact, analytically, it's not difficult to do. It's just conceptually it didn't occur to me. So this is a great point, and this definitely marries this whole literature with the Piketty work definitely. So thanks again for that work. And again, the recommendations, I completely agree with both of the comments you gave. We should have the separation of results, discussing separately about high and low income countries, more discussion about methodology. In fact, I also would like to write more about the results, explain the results even more. But the way when we did this, we thought of this as a thought-provoking paper. Okay, we do this, share it to the rest of the world, and see. Expect a few dozen papers coming out of it from different people by improvising, taking one part of it and improving it and so on. So that was the idea, but I definitely agree. I myself want to contribute to some of those papers. So that's a great thing. And coming to Frank's points, all are well taken. Thank you so much in terms of the various difficulties in LDCs and developing countries in general. But briefly coming to this AFCFTA, I did another paper focusing on AFCFTA, Continental Free Trade Agreement, and its impact on emissions, potential impact on emissions, not only CO2 but also non-CO2 emissions and air pollutants. That was published in the Journal of African Trade. I'll be happy to share that. But we look at only one part of it. In terms of protectionism, yes, that's still there, and in not only in African countries but even in many developing countries, it's still there. And people think more about the revenue rather than the benefits of trade liberalization and so on. Informality is a big thing, so I agree with you, and cost of reform. So I think basically I agree with all the points you mentioned. Thanks. And I forgot Caroline. So Caroline's comments are really very, very profound, very thought-provoking. Thank you, Caroline. In fact, I would it really like what I can say after hearing from you is that we should talk more, actually. So the economic modelers and social scientists and particularly this human rights framework was fascinating to hear from you. Even the limited introduction you gave was very fascinating, and this changes the whole way we approach this. And I agree with you. This bottom up and this conversation we have to have between bottom up and top down, qualitative and quantitative. I completely agree with you. No model is perfect. We all have to work together. And one small thing I wanted to mention about this. This another amazing point you raised about thinking of all these things together rather than saying that GDP is increasing, emissions is falling, and so on. One idea I had on that, and I've done in bits and pieces in different papers, is to basically understand the. I mean, it's again a controversial thing, and we nobody is going to. It's not going to be a consensus, but at least we can have for policymakers, as far as I've seen, and even now I'm also here on this side of the table. We always like numbers. We always like some kind of quantification that this is better, this is not good, and so on. So in that context, I did try to quantify even the economic benefit of emissions reduction or economic benefit of health, public health interventions. So like undernourishment. So those kind of things. There it is coming from emissions, it's coming from physical damage, like how much physical damage can happen because of emissions, because of submergence and so on, and then get that into GDP effects, the economic damage functions and so on. When you think of undernourishment, it's about, of course, we are not thinking of people as people, but we're thinking of people as laborers, labor supply. And if people are getting malnourished, they're going to disappear or they're going to be unproductive, and that has an economic effect. So that is another way I had worked on other papers, but here also probably I could have imputed some value, like emissions goes down so much, so GDP can go up so much, and malnourishment goes down so much and GDP goes up by so much, and so on. But that's just a very kind of tentative solution to what you said, but a lot more has to be done. We have to treat them together. We have to have a very, very compelling, like an integrated narrative. And I have one last question from Caroline about when you have looked at employment with regard to inequality between male and females, as with transfers, did you look at informal sector workers too? Actually, I did not do in that particular paper. So I've done these papers with different things in bits and pieces. So I did another separate paper where we had some data on informal employment as well, and there we did some discussion on that. But informal sector is like you can imagine, like also Frank mentioned, it's really difficult to capture. But fortunately, there are some surveys, like for example, in India, we have some surveys on unorganized sector, informal sector, and so on. So we can quantify to some extent. But I have done some work on this. I've done some work focusing on informal sector, basically, but not in this integrated framework together, but separately. But yes, I think broadly, after hearing from all of you, and I think first of all, I thank all of you, very thought-provoking comments, and we all should work together in the future. But I think one thing is that, as Dirk also rightly put it, we always work, on a paper at one paper at a time. And in this paper, we already compressed a lot of things in those 40 pages. And there are all the issues you raised and all the discussion points we had. It all probably each one of them can evolve into a paper. But I think what is more important is to have an integrated framework, or in one place in which we have all these things put together. That is something that will be really wonderful, that probably all of us can co-create, like a book or a huge volume where we have all these things together. I think that will be wonderful, coming out of the shackles of a research paper to publish in a journal where we just have to write in a very few pages. So that's my final thought based on all this discussion, and I really feel the need of doing that kind of coordinated effort. So thank you very much once again.
Thank you so much, Badri. Very rich discussion today, and I think with that sort of positive note and optimism, we really do need to look across the different approaches and across the different frameworks and really explore further. So we really invite you to sort of work with us further on these different important aspects. And of course, you're joining us on other lectures at IDS. So we're really happy for you to be with us on board. I'd like to thank everybody who's joined us either on this event or live. This series will continue. The next one is on the 17th of March with Alan Winters on trade and poverty. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much, Badri. Thanks, Caroline. Thank you, Dirk. And thanks, Frank. We will be in touch and we'll continue, I'm sure, and taking this forward. Thanks all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
Caroline, Frank, and Dirk. Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Bye.